Pick up those 3d6 and don't you dare ask about point buys. It's the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the pros and cons of Hexcrawl or player-led play. Right, so to kick this episode off, I'm pretty familiar with Hexcrawls, but Hannah, what do you understand it to mean when I say Hexcrawl in terms of like role-playing?
So, hex, obviously, hexagons.
Yeah.
Crawl implies something like a dungeon crawl.
Yeah.
Now, since I've seen these Hexcrawl maps being like quite a big map, I'm assuming that refers to crawling across the hexagons on that map.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Now, essentially what a hexcrawl is, as you were saying, you will have like a basic terrain map of the world, the area, whatever, and it will be covered with hexagons. In the old school days, I mean, hexcrawls have been around since like 1st edition D&D. Each hex would have a number on it, so the GM could refer to that number. The idea of a hexcrawl campaign is you're not sort of told, like, this is your quest, this is what you're doing. The idea is you plonk down on the map, you explore the map, you find things on the map, like dungeons, lairs, treasures, lost cities, stuff like that. You explore them as a group, and you do your normal dungeon crawly and stuff like that based on that.
Okay.
So what I've done is I've listed a few pros and cons for hexcrawls. Now let me start by saying I'm a big fan of hexcrawls myself. I love them, but I do appreciate they're not entirely without their issues for some people. So to start off, let's start off with the cons first, some of the difficulties. Then we can end on a nice positive note. So one of the cons of a hexcrawl is there's no clearly defined goal beyond exploration. So if you start off an adventure and you're given the mission to go and kill the evil necromancer, you have a goal, you point yourself in that direction, and everything you do normally is sort of moving you towards that goal. Whereas in a hexcrawl, beyond explore the map, find cool new stuff, there isn't any sort of clearly defined goal. And this leads me into my second con, which is the players really have to motivate themselves. So if you're in a dungeon, you don't really have to come up with motivations and reasons to do things, because you're like, we're in a dungeon, the aim is to get through to it, kill the bad guy, get the treasure, get the XP, whatever, and get out alive. Whereas in a hexcrawl, you have to find reasons for your character to want to explore, to want to reveal this map. Because later on you might develop plots, so you might have like a bandit who steals something off you and gets away, and you're like, yeah, we're going to get revenge on him. But at the start, your motivation is literally, I'm going to go and see what's out there. But you have to have like an in-character rationale and want to get out there and explore, otherwise the game doesn't give you anything. From a GM perspective, one of the other cons is that it can be difficult to map and plan as the map expands. Because at the start, normally like you start hex with like a village or a settlement or somewhere you're safe, like a home base, and you might detail out like 3 or 4 hexes around that. Now that's easy to do for the GM. You create a few random encounter tables, you maybe drop a couple of like dungeons in. However, as the map's uncovered, the number of hexes available exponentially increases, and it becomes very difficult as a GM to have stuff planned for each potential hex. Now, there'll be some hexes that don't have a great deal of interest in them, but if you want people to go there, you've got to make sure there's interesting stuff out there to like make it worth exploring. So if you've got, I don't know, let's say the next time they expand the map, you've got like an extra 30 hexes, and you have no idea of knowing which way they're going to go, it's very difficult to come up with an adventure to like fill each of those 30 hexes. Now, there are ways you can do it. I mean, obviously you can have random tables, you can have random dungeon generators, you can have stuff like that. Or if you're more comfortable with like doing stuff on the fly, you can just sort of roll with it and make notes so that you can keep it consistent afterwards. And as you start developing it, you will come up with like links between things. So let's say you have an area that's a swamp and you get a random encounter where there's some lizard man. Then you have another hex next to it, which is like a hilly terrain, sort of marshy terrain. And you see there's a goblin tribe there. You might go, oh, lizard folk and goblins. Maybe there's a bit of like a war going on between the lizard folk. And you can expand on it like that. But until you've sort of got the comfort level with doing that, or you're comfortable enough with being sort of ad hoc, it can be a little daunting to prepare for one of these games. Now, the last thing I've got down for cons, which I've also put as a pro as well, because it depends on your view, is that it emphasises random charts and randomness, as I've just been talking about, because there's a lot of things that can be determined randomly, like the weather. A lot of the hex crawls, they determine randomly what the terrain is when you move into a new hex, whether there's an encounter there, what the notable features are of a hex. And if you like randomisation, like I love a random chart, that's absolutely great, and you will have no problems with that. If you're a more sort of structured GM, or you prefer there to be less randomness, you've either got to plan out more stuff in the hexes, or you're going to find a hex crawl very difficult to run, because part of the reason that people tend to use these random charts is just because planning out everything like deliberately is an awful lot of work. And that's not the only reason they use random charts. I mean, a lot of people like myself like a bit of randomness. It keeps it a bit spicy for the GM. But if you're not in that way inclined, you can be setting yourself up for an awful lot of work if you're running a hex crawl, because you'll have to populate the map and everything in advance.
So you've mentioned the map expanding a couple of times.
Yeah.
What circumstances lead to that happening?
Okay.
I mean, say my players, day one, hex number 1 is the tavern, and they just stay there.
Yeah. Now, your hex wouldn't tend to be I see what you're saying, but the hex wouldn't tend to be a tavern, it tends to be a town, because it's not like a sort of world-scale map. However, what I say when I mean expanding the map is, in some cases, you will have like all the rough terrain drawn out on the map, but beyond that, you won't know what's in the hex. So you might go up to the north, there's a forest hex, but it's only when you go into that hex, using whatever travel rules your game uses, the ref will roll or will have determined what's in there. And you might be like, as you're exploring this forest, you find a mysterious stone circle, or there's a bandit encampment in the woods, and you don't know about that until you get there. That's part of the whole sort of idea of hex crawls, exploring these hexes. Now, some games take that to a bit of an extreme, where you won't see all the surrounding terrain. You'll literally just see the hex you're in. And the GM might say, there's some mountains off to the north, and there's this, that, other. And you literally only find out the terrain and stuff when you move to it. Now, if you move to a hex, because obviously normally you can see, one of the sort of standard measures for hexes, it tends to be like sort of 6 miles-ish per hex that you travel. Now, obviously, I think that's because you can see about 3 miles if the terrain's flat, if I remember correctly. Now, what most refs will tend to do is, if you move into a hex, they'll tell you like everything what's in that hex, or you can explore it, but then it will reveal the hexes around it. Because if you're sort of, especially if you're on like raised like mountains or hills, you'd be able to look over and go, there's a forest there to the east. So the ref might go, there's these hexes, and they roll for them, but they won't tell you what's in them until you go and explore them. So that's what I mean when I say the map's being revealed. The players are exploring it, and they're finding out more what's on it, and either they or the GM may like put some notes on the maps, like stone circle here, goblin lair here, that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by that.
Okay.
Right, so I'm going to move on to some of the pros or positive points for hex crawls, as far as I'm concerned. The first is that it's exploration heavy. Now, that may not be to everyone's taste, but we often hear sort of like old school D&D games being criticised because they're just about monster killing and grabbing treasure and stuff like that. Whereas the default assumption of the hex crawl is, of course you still kill monsters, you still get treasure and XP and whatever. It's D&D, of course you do.
Yeah.
But the default sort of reward is for exploring the map, and some games will sort of grant XP when you discover new areas and strange things. So it's an extra sort of facet of the game as far as I'm concerned, and it also leads into one of the things I love, which we talked about when we did our hex flower for the barroom brawlers. I like these little mini games that you sort of have, certainly within older D&D. Yeah, and travel is a little mini game in the hex crawl, because you'll have like your rations or whatever, your food supplies, and as you're moving around the hexes, they will be ticking down. So you'll have like a little mini game where it might be like, you get, if you want to hunt to try and like get enough food for you to live on, you have to roll a d6. If you get a 1, you've succeeded. But it might be like if you're a ranger or you're a druid, you get a slightly increased chance. Whoever's leading the party, if they say, I want to go from hex here to this hex here, whoever's like your sort of your cartographer or whatever, your wayfinder, they'll roll a dice to see if they get lost, and it's normally a small chance, like 1 in 6, but like weather conditions might sort of raise or lower that. So if you get lost, you might find yourself moving in a random direction into a different hex and find something you weren't expecting. And obviously you've got to like keep your hirelings under control. If you've got loads of stuff, you've got to have carts to transport it. And it brings in a lot more sort of like logistical thinking, but not, because, I'm not a big fan of the whole sort of like scanning through like reams of equipment and stuff like that. But I quite like the way it's handled in terms of a little mini game, because it basically comes down to rolling a few D6s just to give you a bit of a flavour of it. So you don't normally get into like vast amounts of detail, but it encourages like just the sort of right amount of bookkeeping I'm comfortable with.
Yeah.
So for instance, like every time you move a hex, every time you travel 6 miles or whatever, let's say, and I know some of you out there are going to shout, oh no, you can travel 24 miles in a day in like D&D or whatever. But yeah, I'm just sort of going on these standard figures. So if you knew in a game that every hex you moved, every 6 miles you travel, you're going to take one of your rations, and you're like, oh, I'm travelling from there to there, so I know that's like 30 miles. You go, all right, well, we're going to need 30 rations. That's just for one person. All right, we're going to need 30 rations for everybody. All right, well, that's quite a lot to carry. So, all right, we're going to need some hirelings. But if we hire some hirelings, they'll need rations. Or we need a cart. But if we hire a cart and we have horses, they need rations. And so on and so forth. So it gives you like an extra bit of thing to think about. But it's not stuff that's going to like slow you down for hours and hours.
So this isn't for any specific system. This is something you could put over any system.
I mean, most systems you could do a hex crawl with. I mean, they tend to be associated with older D&D and stuff like that, because hex crawls were like quite big when D&D sort of, not when it first came out, but sort of like they were a pretty early on sort of thing. Although they fell out of fashion for a bit, as more story-led sort of campaigns and stuff like that started to come in. But when the whole OSR thing sort of blew up and like people were getting interested in playing the old games again, hex crawling's made a bit of a comeback. And I think, again, to highlight another positive point, I think one of the reasons for that is that there's a minimal initial setup required for a hex crawl. Like if you're starting with just like a few hexes showing on your map, what do you need really? You need to know about the little home base and maybe 3 hexes around it. So that's max like 3 adventures, which you can easily drop pre-published adventures in. You can have a random encounter table, which will cover you for the rest of the stuff. So, and especially if you're running like D&D, which has some hard-baked setting assumptions in it, you don't really need a lot of prep. If you say, oh yeah, we're playing like a standard D&D style world, great D&D characters, right, we're playing a hex crawl, you're starting off in generic Townburg, and there's a forest there, there's some hills there and some plains there, here's a few rumours you've heard, go at it.
Cool.
And if you've got players who are willing to sort of grab hold of that and go, oh, I wonder what's going on with those caves we've heard about up the north, or oh yeah, we could go and explore the forest, there's rumours of like giant spiders and whatever. If you've got players who will jump on it like that, hex crawls are great, because you just have to like come up with a few things at the start, throw them in at the deep end, let the game unravel as it will. But as I say, that can lead to it getting a little bit more complex and a little bit more sort of prep heavy later on. But certainly at the start, the initial setup requirement is fairly minimal. And it's also, another pro is it's easy to slot prepared modules and stuff like that in. So if I go, oh yeah, you've heard a rumour there's some mysterious caves to the north, and they explore this hex and they find some caves. How many like D&D adventures are there with like caves in and dungeons? I could easily, as long as I've not been too detailed, I can easily pick any of them, and all I've got to make a note on in my little sort of GM version of the map is, in this hex is this adventure. They go to that hex, I pull out that adventure and its map, run it through. Now, if they've been to this hex already, which is another thing I love about hex crawls, is the fact that when you're running a slightly more linear sort of quest-based D&D, you tend to do one quest, that quest is done, on to the next. Whereas in a hex crawl, you go and like clear out a cave full of like goblins, and then like 3 months down the line, you go back to it. There might be other monsters that have moved in there. There might be other stuff going on there. Now, there's random tables you can use for this. The GM could just decide, like, oh, I'll make a wandering monster check. If I get something, yes, something else has colonised the caves, I'll roll a dice, see what it is. Or they could plan something out, whatever they want to do. But it encourages people to like go back to places. And if you sort of discover other towns and other settlements, you can really sort of build up a sense of a world that's sort of ticking by when the players aren't there, but that they can always sort of drop in on and sort of visit, which gives it a bit of that sort of not realism, like that verisimilitude of the setting, where it feels like a 3-dimensional setting. The final positive point I want to bring up for hex crawls is that it has a built-in structure. Now, if you don't like that structure, that might be a bit of a problem. But the fact is, if you're doing like a slightly more narrative game or a different format of game, you might have to do more work coming up with the structure and sort of setting it in place, letting the players know what it is, what's expected of them in the game. Whereas most people who are familiar with D&D will have at least heard of Hexcrawls. I mean, as you say, you're not very familiar with them, love, but you pretty much nailed the essentials of it at the start of this episode. And once someone goes like, yeah, you're absolutely right, and the aim of this game is explore the map, find interesting things, that structure's already in place. So you don't have to wonder what your goal is, it's to explore. Now, as we said when we were talking about cons, that can also be a bit of a problem because beyond exploration, there's often not clear goals, and you need a party of players who are capable of motivating themselves and really throwing themselves into the exploration mode. If you go, oh, there's the map, have at, and your players are like, oh, no, I'm not really sure what to do. I'll come in, like, stay in the tavern a bit and in generic Townburg and whatever, then the game is not going to go anywhere because the Hexcrawl doesn't push you to do anything like a more sort of linear, like quest-based sort of adventure might.
It strikes me that if you had like friendly NPCs in many of the hexes,
yeah,
that would be quite a good way to motivate players. You know, we did that whole thing about bars and barmen and the tavern,
yep,
and ways to get an adventure into the tavern. You've got a couple of NPCs that they're friendly with that like bring them missions.
Yeah, and that's
strikes me
absolutely
as
right.
the sort of thing that would be really good for the like adventurers for hire sort of group setup.
Absolutely, and on the blog of the Alexandrian, which I very much enjoy reading, he talks a lot about Hexcrawls on there. I'll put a link in the description. He's talking about one of his campaigns that he's running, although it's a very old post, where he's saying that the adventurers were hired and they were given sort of like bounties for like discovering new places and new resources and stuff like that. So yeah, you can easily give them a bit of a push, but at the end of the day, that's all it is, a little bit of a push. Once you give them that push, they've then got to run with it. Otherwise, if they're just sort of like, oh, we know that wizard said we're going to explore, but no, I'm not really sure about it, the game won't really do anything for them. You get like any game, you get out as much as you put it in, basically, is what it comes down to. So I think that's it for this episode on Hexcrawls. If anyone out there has any comments or suggestions regarding Hexcrawls, or you'd like to see me warble on some more about them, then you can drop us a voicemail message using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the description. Or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye.